So we've got three great speakers today joining us to talk about marshes and basics and trends and processes to help fuel some of our future conversations. Our first presenter is Dr. Neil Ganju. He is a research oceanographer at U.S. Geological Survey's Woods Hole Coastal and Marine Science Center. He leads the Estuarine Processes, Hazards, and Ecosystems project. His work focuses on estuaries broadly using observational, modeling, and remote sensing techniques to understand the physical and biogeochemical processes that control estuarine function. He aims to provide coastal managers with a mechanistic understanding of how estuaries behave and useful products to assist in management under climatic and anthropogenic forcing. So it sounds like we have the right guy to come talk to this group. We really look forward to hearing from you, Neil. And with that, I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Jesse, for inviting me. And I'm glad to show you folks what I've been working on and some tools that might be relevant for restoration and practice in the Mid-Atlantic and obviously nationally as well. So let me go ahead and share this in full screen. And you should be good.
Looks good. Looks great. Thank you.
So I just want to acknowledge my co-authors, Zafira Daphne and Kate Ackerman here in this office are the kind of geospatial experts who did all of the actual analysis you'll see here for the most part. And then Brady Couvillon's in our Wetland Aquatic Research Center down in Louisiana. He's an expert on the Landsat metrics that I won't actually be showing today, but I am going to point you to some resources at the end that have some of these Landsat-derived layers for the entire nation that might be of use for practice in the Mid-Atlantic and elsewhere. So generally what I'm going to talk about today is how we can use some geospatial metrics for salt marshes to guide monitoring and restoration. And I'll give some kind of practical examples of that. Danielle and Jesse were very keen to make sure that I gave some key messages. So I'm actually going to start with them and then repeat them to the end so that I don't forget what I'm talking about as well. So firstly, tidal wetlands and salt marshes specifically are biogeomorphic features. So my focus is on the physical aspect of sediment budgets and using those as an indicator of where they're headed, but that's in concert with the biology of the salt marsh, with the biogeochemical processes, with the growth both below ground and above ground. Another key message that I want to deliver is that with sea level rise and storms, the natural response of a salt marsh system, of a barrier island, any coastal system, is transgression, which means rolling back landward along that ocean-land continuum. So that's the natural response. And I found it helpful when I am thinking lately about restoration management actions of trying to, in my mind, decide, okay, is that action something that is actually aiding the transgression process? Is it moving landforms in the landward direction with sea level rise and storms, or are we trying to fight it? And I will give examples, obviously. I'm sure all of you can name examples of both of those cases. The second key message is basically the meat of the talk about geospatial metrics and why are they useful and why are we using them. I'll show some examples of how they can be used to aid in decision making. And then lastly, I'm going to very briefly touch on what they call the RAD framework. This is a new concept, relatively new concept in the ecosystem management world, as well as the Fish and Wildlife Service, where I first heard about it. And it's not really a radical change of anything we're doing in practice, but it's a way of thinking about our actions in regards to preservation of ecosystems in response to climate change and deciding which of these categories our actions fall into. Are we resisting, accepting, or directing the effects of climate change? And we'll talk about that as well, just briefly. So when I talk about salt marsh geomorphology and the vulnerability of salt marshes, there's really three separate processes that you can consider. So edge erosion on the landward edge due to waves is a natural process, obviously, but it's a function of how big those waves are, the elevation of the marsh, and the actual characteristics of the substrate. So that's one thing that's moving your marsh in at the seaward end. Within the marsh, we have internal deterioration, and this is something we're all familiar with in the Mid-Atlantic. And ultimately, there's lots of different things that cause internal deterioration. It can be sea level rise, it can be sediment deficits, it can be invasive rats, it can be crabs, it can be salinity stress during storms. But ultimately, that internal deterioration can be diagnosed through the open water conversion and the elevation loss of that part of the marsh plain. And then lastly, migration potential is your last kind of mechanism. And that's a very complicated function of land slope, inundation frequency from tides and storms, the salinity of the groundwater, as well as the overlying water, the land use, the canopy cover. And obviously, we're still scratching the surface on some of these, but just generally wanted to make sure folks can kind of cast the work we do on geomorphic vulnerability of salt marshes in these three boxes. It makes it helpful when talking about actions and trajectory of the whole system. So today I'm only going to be focusing really on internal deterioration, but the concepts overall cover all three of these things, but we'll just be talking about the internal processes. So if you think about internal deterioration, the concept that we started with, about, well, really 20 years ago, but really hammered away at it about 10 years ago, is the idea of a sediment budget telling you which way the system is going in terms of internal deterioration. Now, each of these things on the left in red is a withdrawal of the sediment budget of a marsh. So you have the edge slumping into the mudflat, you have the mudflat eroding, and then ultimately the channel can erode. Or you can have deposits. You can have sediment depositing on the marsh plain at high tide, as well as on the mudflat where vegetation can then colonize. You can see this block here that's fallen over is now recolonizing and stabilizing itself. And you can get deposition in the channel. Now, measuring each one of these is obviously quite difficult. So we took the approach of trying to get a net sediment budget for a whole system by measuring sediment fluxes in large channels that drain wetlands. And so the concept is if you can measure this whole system sediment budget, if a marsh is importing enough sediment to keep up with sea level rise, then it must be in a stable trajectory or perhaps expanding. However, if it's losing sediment from the system, it must be contracting because you're deepening the channels, you're deepening the mudflats, you might be slumping the marsh, you might be converting open water. So the idea was, can we identify a proxy for that process that will help tie sediment budgets to deterioration and instability? So we made measurements across the country, 8 sites across the country, 1 from the literature, 7 that we measured sediment budgets at. And these are from all over the country. We've done several since then. But basically, we were looking for some independent measure that we could tie to the sediment budget. So if we can measure sediment budget and we see that a system is losing or gaining, we want some other independent metric to gauge how stable that marsh might be. So one of the first things we tried was percent open water, and then ultimately what we ended up doing was just taking the ratio of unvegetated areas, which you see in these bluish colors, or black in this case, and the other colors as vegetated. And the idea was, if a marsh is stable, it should have sort of an optimal vegetation cover. If it's falling apart, it should have a suboptimal. And this was driven by, end members such as Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge down here in the bottom left, which is obviously, one of the poster children for marsh loss. And given its open water, it seemed like a good place to start. So we collected sediment budget measurements over the periods of months to a year, and then we used aerial imagery to calculate this unvegetated vegetated ratio across those same systems to see if these things were related. So obviously, spoiler alert, they are related. And so this plot here, each dot is one of those sites, and on the y-axis is the sediment budget relative to sea level rise. So this is the amount of sediment import or export we measured minus the deficit, local deficit to sea level rise. And then on the x-axis, is this unvegetated vegetated marsh ratio. So the first thing you notice is that every site we measured at was below 0. So that means they're all in a deficit condition. None of them were importing enough sediment to keep up with sea level rise. The second thing you can see is that there's somewhat of a tipping point. It looks like around 0.1, where marshes might actually have a surplus if they're below a UVBR of 0.1. And conceptually, this all makes sense. If you have an intact marsh that has no stress and it's building its own material in the bottom, in the below ground substrate, it's trapping material with its above ground biomass, it should be stable. It should not have a lot of open water other than the drainage channels. However, if something perturbs the system and you start losing vegetation, whether it's herbivory from crabs or it's eutrophication causing slumping, then you start converting to open water. You lose that trapping function of the salt marsh plants, and sediment starts getting exported. So it's a really nice conceptual model. And again, we see the stability value at around 0.1. A couple of studies since then. This study was a numerical modeling study, found a value of 0.13. And another study we did with aerial imagery found 0.15. So there's this nice kind of coalescence around a value somewhere between 0.1 and 0.15 for a stability value. So if you're lower than that, your marsh tends to be stable. If you're above that, it tends to be unstable. And this is what that looks like at 3 sites, for example. So this is Fishing Bay in Maryland. This is Reedy Creek in Barnegat Bay. And this is Blackwater, also in Chesapeake Bay. And that was the worst site we measured ever at 1. So after we did that paper, we thought to ourselves, okay, we've established this concept. Now, wouldn't it be nice to map this across the country and specifically the Northeast? So this is the process that we've used to now build this UVVR concept across marsh units of all the Northeast in our current work. So we take the NWI as the first mask using the estuarine emergent wetland class, basically just to identify broadly all the wetlands we care about. And we use elevation data from LIDAR or the CONED to then kind of break the marsh into individual hydrologic units based on topography, as well as ditch features and upland features like you see here, right? So these are kind of, as opposed to doing something that was pixel-based, the idea was a marsh unit is more tangible for a manager who might be looking at individual parcels that are separated by ditches or by uplands. And so far, the feedback we've gotten on this concept has been pretty good. Most folks find that this granularity is good. In some cases, they actually would prefer that we aggregate these units up to bigger units, whether they're hucks or something else. So this has been a pretty good framework so far. So once we calculate those units, we use the aerial imagery from the National Agricultural Imagery Program, as well as the elevation to kind of do a machine learning, unsupervised, supervised classification of each pixel at 1 meter within each marsh unit. And when you do that, then you get this really nice mask of what's vegetated and unvegetated. So what you see in green is vegetated, and what's in pink is unvegetated. And you can see obviously the highest density of unvegetated areas in here in this unit, as well as this unit in the northeast corner. So once you do that, you can calculate this UVVR across each unit. And that's what this looks like. So remember, below 0.1, 0.15 is bad. So really, the greenish colors are your stable ones. Anything above this light green is unstable. So you can see these units through here having relatively high UVVRs. So we're in the process of doing that for the entire Northeast through funding from several agencies over the last, my gosh, I don't know who the first one, it might have been New York State, I can't remember now, or it was Parker River National Wildlife Refuge in 2017, I think. And that's when we started doing this. So our goal is to complete the entire Northeast. We're on track for that in the next couple of years. Obviously, the big area we still have to do is Delaware Bay. And surprisingly, the bigger the salt marsh area, the easier the process is because you have more training data for that classification. It's actually quite less work than a place like Maine, where one swath of aerial imagery might give you one tiny pocket marsh, and so there's not a lot of data to train the classification. So this is where we're at right now. Anything in orange is complete and can be shared with federal partners or state agencies as long as they don't distribute it, but will be published publicly along with the stuff that you already see in blue. So I want to show just one of the science and then management applications of this data. So one of our early studies when we had completed 4 large estuaries, so Plum Island, Cape Cod National Seashore, Great South Bay, and Assateague, one of the first things we did was try to look at connections between elevation and the UVVR. Is there some connection between where you are in the tidal frame and how you are handling horizontal vulnerability to open water conversion? So each of these estuaries had, several hundred marsh units. Plum Island, you see here, had about 1,400. Assateague had about 4,000. Great South Bay had maybe 500 or 1,000. I can't remember. But basically, we pulled all these sites together and tried to do a holistic analysis of how these two variables are related, elevation and UVVR. So what happened was each one of these dots that you see in the light gray in the back is a marsh unit. And what I did was I basically took the relative elevation. So you take the actual measured elevation to mean sea level, and then across each estuary, you subtract out the mean across that estuary, and then you divide by the tide range locally. So you get kind of a demeaned detided elevation. And what we found was that all 4 estuaries kind of collapsed to the same relationship between the UVVR and the elevation. And so what you see up here in the top right is just all that noise taken away and just looking at the bin average data points. And what we see is that at 0 elevation, which basically means the mean, so anything above 0 are units above the mean elevation of the estuary, and anything below 0 is below the mean. We find that they all had a similar distribution, And that tipping point happened at about 0.1. So again, we have evidence that there's something about that value where you tend to have instability lower in the tide frame to the left and stability to the right. So when I saw this was great, we published it, it was done. And then I got to wondering about all of these dots that you see that are not along that relationship. So there's a lot of points, you can see them out here that are low elevation or high elevation rather, and high UVVR. And then you see points over here that are low elevation and high UVVR, or low elevation and low UVVR. And I got to wondering, well, what's going on at those units? So I really literally dug in to each one of these dots, pulled up the lat long, looked at the maps, just so I understood what was going on. And from that, I came up with some good ways to use these data for management. So I thought of this really simple decision matrix. And basically you have UVVR on the x-axis here, you have elevation on the y, and we're just binning high and low. So we know that high elevation is good because you have elevation capital. We know that low UVVR is good because you've got complete vegetative cover, which scales with your ecosystem services. And we know that low is bad. So we picked an arbitrary threshold, 0.4 meters in the case I'm going to show you here. And again, that UVVR value, 0.15. So the idea here is if you have a marsh in this top left quadrant, it's intact, both horizontally and vertically. So it doesn't have any open water conversion, and it's high in the tide frame. There's nothing really you need to do other than protect that parcel, conserve it, or look at options to facilitate upland migration if that's an opportunity there. Now, conversely, in the bottom right, you have low elevation marshes that are also falling apart laterally. So they have open water conversion and they're low. This is a case where you need to look at the co-benefits. Is this parcel providing a significant co-benefit that it would be worth actually doing the restoration? So is it providing habitat for, let's say, salt marsh sparrow? Is it providing protection for some kind of feature like a road or public access point? Or is it providing significant carbon sequestration in an area that has not many other options, right? So that's where you have to kind of evaluate. Now, on the top right, though, are examples of marshes that are high at elevation. So they have elevation capital, but they also have a high UVVR. So they have some open water conversion happening, but the marsh plain that's existing, it has high elevation capital. So those are good candidates for restoration because you've already got some capital in the marsh plain. So sediment augmentation, whether through thin layer or diversion of some sort, facilitating revegetation through runnels or some other processes, if it's just bare sediment, are good options. And in the bottom left here, we have the monitor box. So this is low elevation marshes that are still intact horizontally. These would be cases where you would want to monitor if you're not already monitoring, or look at causes of that low elevation. Is it behind a tidal restriction? Is there a sediment, is there locally high sediment, sea level rise? Is there a sediment supply issue? Now, what's nice about these 4 boxes, I'm going to show 4 examples just visually first before I show you the mapping. Here are 4 examples from Barnegat Bay. Interestingly enough, this bottom right one, when I first showed it, I did not know that it was slated for a restoration project, but of course it is. So I was lucky to pick that, I guess maybe unlucky, because initially this didn't say evaluate, it said abandon or do nothing, which I've now, thanks to talks with stakeholders and managers, I've learned that that's not the best nomenclature to use. So now evaluate is what we're saying. So here are 4 examples, low elevation, or sorry, high elevation, low UVVR up at the top, so that's good. Nothing to be done other than protect or acquire. And then at the bottom right, here's a parcel next to an elementary school as well as a bunch of infrastructure. Great candidate for restoration because it's providing a significant protection service. And then the other 2 is again examples where sediment augmentation or ditch remediation might be good. And down here where you might want to watch for conversion of those open areas with sea level rise and or sediment deficits. Now, what's nice about this approach is you can map it on the landscape. So very simply, and these are all data that are published online on ScienceBase, you can take these marsh units and then you can just do a sorting and a clustering in ARC or whatever you use to look at those 4 classes. So here they are colored on the landscape. So again, dark blue is protect. Those are the ones that are intact. And in the Chesapeake, we see this throughout in the Delmarva. A lot of those high marshes are right along the edge of the estuary where there's ample sediment supply. And a lot of the deterioration is actually internal to some of these peninsulas. And so you see that in a couple areas. Some of these are managed impoundments and some of these are just really impacted marshes. And then you see a couple of these restore squares. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an example of a restore parcel right up here right against the forest boundary, and an abandoned parcel in this open water area here. And these are actually published in a paper that just came out in Estuaries and Coasts, the management applications paper. I'll put the link in at the end. But basically, this top left one is evaluate, not abandon, evaluate parcel. So it's right in the middle of this open water area. It's low elevation, high UVBR, so it's not doing well. And this is the imagery on the right, so you can see the open water. This is a case where, if there isn't a significant species consideration, if there isn't any infrastructure being protected, and this might be far away from a sediment source unless there's local dredging in this pond, might not be worth the investment given the size of the unit and its state. On the other hand, we have a restore parcel, and this is a high elevation parcel right along the forest boundary. It's got some open water that I think is probably due to duck habitat creation. This is a classic case we see a lot in the Chesapeake, where you have degraded areas right on the forest marsh boundary. If you want to aid in upland migration of marshes, these are great places to facilitate that by healing this portion of the marsh and allowing an unbroken continuum from the marsh into the forest with sea level rise. The last metric I wanted to show, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but know that it is available online as well. And we're just rolling out a calculator that can calculate the marsh lifespan using our data. And that's also in that Chesapeake Bay paper that I mentioned. Basically, what the lifespan does is it computes how much sediment is in a marsh unit above sea level. And so that takes into account the elevation of the vegetated part of the plain as well as the UVVR. So you're actually just accounting for that sediment capital above sea level in the vegetated plain, which is kind of a novel thing, but pretty straightforward and pretty easy for all of us to grasp. And all we do is we compare that massive sediment with the deficit induced by sea level rise and sediment export. And that gives you a time scale of how much time you have before your sediment capital is expended. And you can tweak it with different sea level rise knobs as well as different bulk densities. And that's all in this calculator that will be rolled out very soon. So far, a lot of our partners have used it. One of the actually best uses that Fish and Wildlife has deployed is communicating specifically in Chincoteague Bay here. Oh, should have done that. Communicating the benefit you get from remediating anthropogenic actions such as ditching. So on the Maryland side, where ditching was extensive, we have significantly lowered lifespans. On the Virginia side, with a lot less ditching, we have much higher lifespans. So it's a really nice binary way to show what we could get from potentially restoring our historic actions. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the RAD framework. So again, this isn't anything drastically different than how we think about projects now, but it's a way to frame them. So, and think also about a given action not necessarily being only in one of these boxes. I guess I'm on auto advanced. That's fine. But thinking about how some actions might be somewhere on the continuum between two of these. You might be accepting something now with the idea that you'll be able to direct it later, right? So there's a time component in this as well as spatial. So resist is easy. These are a lot of things we've been doing. So a living shoreline is attempting to lock the boundary in place. So that's, again, fighting transgression, resisting sea level rise. Sediment augmentation, depending on where the sediment is coming from, could be considered resisting. Runneling open water areas that used to be marsh would be considered resistance, as well as ditch remediation. Acceptance is the easy one. That's the one where we just let climate change and sea level rise transform ecosystems. And so all the conversions that we're seeing now, whether it's marsh to mudflat, forest to marsh, ag field to marsh, tidal freshwater, salt marsh, all of those are basically accepting what sea level rise and climate change will do. And then lastly, the really interesting one is directing, and that's where we actively transform an ecosystem or a landscape to some other state than what it is currently or where it was, in order to kind of facilitate what we think it might be or what we want it to be. And so here's an example, obviously, from Prime Hook, where a lot of connectivity was undertaken. Some of the actions maybe at Prime Hook would be considered resist. Others would be considered direct, and others might be considered accept, right? But all of these different actions that I've listed here under direct are examples of potential direction. All right, so in closing, sediment budgets in my mind are the gold standard for understanding which way systems are going, but we can't do them everywhere. We do need to do more of these in active restoration areas. I'm currently starting a project here locally at a created marsh to try and investigate the trajectories of these systems with sea level rise and storms. In the Northeast, as I said, we're continuing and doing a lot of analysis with these data. And if anybody needs help accessing them, what we've published, let me know. I'm going to put 2 links in the chat in a second. And we're doing an SDM process using some of these data to prioritize marsh restoration of the park service in the Northeast. And then lastly, there are national metrics that we've done at 30-meter resolution that might be useful for looking at restoration projects if you bring in not just the UVVR, but also above ground biomass, which tells you something about habitat, as well as the tidal elevation, which tells you something about relative to position in the landscape. And I'll put those links in here with my key messages, which I already told you. I won't repeat them. I will copy and paste these 2 links in the bottom into the chat so you have them. I'm assuming I can't really highlight them. Oh, not supposed to see that. All right, and with that, I will stop sharing, put these links in the chat, and glad to take any clarifying questions, I think, correct?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Neil. That was fantastic. Yeah, I think we're going to do majority of the Q&A at the end, but if there are any clarifying questions anyone has right away, we probably have time for 1 or 2. So I'll give you guys a second there. And if not, think about your questions otherwise. And Danielle, if you want to, oh, got one. Mattia.
Yeah, hi, Neil. Thanks so much for your presentation. My question was about the slide where you have, I don't know what number it was, but it was that the 4-piece rubric of the protect, restore, monitor, evaluate. And you said that on the, yep, that one, on the left-hand side, that 0.4 meters, that you just picked that, but we would, if we were coming up with this framework, we would want to do that with the site-specific elevation relative to the tidal datum, right? That's
right, absolutely. And I think in this case, this was the median elevation of that local area, and that's something that we've used elsewhere, the median. But yeah, relative to mean sea level or NAVD, it doesn't really matter as long as you're using a consistent value. Yep.
great, thank you.
And one thing I did mention, I should have, is that what's nice about this is if an agency had a certain acreage that they wanted to peg for restoration, for example, you could just move these values around, slide them around until you get that area that you're targeting, and then you'd get it. You know what I mean? You can just change the thresholds till you get the distribution you want.
Great. And one more question from Wendy.
Hi, I'm just a guest here. This is my first time at one of the CHARM meetings, and that was super informative, and I appreciate the opportunity to sit in on the talks today. My question was about the mapping that projected the time frame, sort of the lifespan of the marshes. So I guess I was assuming that that might be time frame from sort of like its current condition to sort of like an open water condition. I'm not sure if that's correct, but then I was also wondering if this methodology could be adapted or even used as is to also get a little finer grain and try to project a lifespan or a conversion factor that's short of open water. So the one that's really important to a lot of at-risk species is that conversion point from high marsh to low marsh.
Right. Right. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, you could pick an arbitrary window. Yeah, if you had an elevation threshold that you knew was your conversion point, you could just, yeah, you would just calculate the lifespan under the present day, and then you would input the elevation that you're thinking low marshes in your system and take the difference of the two. I think that would kind of get you that. Yeah, that's a great question. And just conceptually, right? So conceptually, then you highlighted something important. Is conceptually what this is saying, and you said it right. And I'll just rephrase it. It's how long you have until that vegetated marsh plain has to smear itself out over the whole unit, distributed evenly, to be just subtidal mudflat. So you're going from all vegetated marsh to a mudflat at 0 mean sea level. So like you said, you could say, okay, well, we're wondering if what happens if it gets to 20 centimeters above sea level, because that's our low marsh threshold in our system. You could back out the calculation to make it, you know, whatever it is now to 20 centimeters everywhere.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much, Neil. That was an excellent presentation.
My
And
pleasure.
it ties in really well to our next speaker. We have Dr. Joe Smith. He is a lead wildlife biologist for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Edwin B. Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge. He is an experienced ecologist that works on implementing and researching restoration and conservation projects in coastal marshes and forests. He is also focused on the ecology of migratory birds. And I once read in one of Joe's interviews, he said, the great thing about working with migratory birds is that they cross so many borders. It allows for the building of global partnerships and information exchange. And I think that's really cool. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, so I'm glad Neil, the last discussion was on his ditch versus unditched slide, because I'll be talking a lot about that today. Yeah, here at Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge, we've got, a lot of ditched marsh. And throughout the Northeast, the statistic we keep repeating is 90% of the marshes in the Northeast are ditched. But despite this, we don't have a lot of information on what the impact of ditching really was. There aren't a ton of studies, looking at marshes before they were ditched, or comparing, ditched to unditched. We just don't have a lot of information, despite how widespread this impact was. And it's probably because it just happened so long ago. Some marshes were ditched, in colonial times for agriculture, and then the rest were ditched for mosquito control, in the early 20th century. We were lucky to have, a nice rich literature, documenting the different eras of mosquito control in New Jersey. And just to review what on earth the purpose was for all these ditches, it was to simply get rid of all the interior open water on these marshes. That was the objective. The belief was that's where the mosquitoes were coming from. That's not entirely correct, but that's what they did, and they were really good at it. They worked at a landscape scale, really, amazing. So they, just drained, the parallel ditches throughout the marshes, and then even I found reference to runnel-like, activities where they would, get the ponds they missed they didn't intersect with the ditch. They'd cut a side channel to drain the ponds, and yeah, sure enough, when you drain a pond, many times the pond will revegetate into marsh. But we're lucky in New Jersey to still have thousands of acres of unditched marsh, and I've been spending a lot of time on these marshes and doing some comparisons. Ponds, take all shapes and forms and depths, and they're ephemeral. They're very dynamic features. They wet, they dry. They create opportunities for wildlife, like here where egrets and gulls are feeding on fish under a low oxygen condition that makes them really vulnerable. And then this draining of the ponds was a big deal. It was a conservation controversy in the mid 20th century, mainly coming from waterfowl biologists and waterfowl hunters who saw the loss of this important habitat on the landscape. And so an early version of the Fish and Wildlife Service, including my man Clarence Cottam, pursued a study of a marsh before it was ditched, and then studied it 10 years afterwards. One thing they found was that when you dry out a marsh with ditching, they converted an alterniflora marsh into something that was mostly high marsh vegetation. So when you dry out that marsh, you can completely change the vegetation composition. But they also found that it affected elevation. So they did careful survey work and documented almost instantaneous loss of elevation out there. And this was due to peat decomposition. This is a figure from something describing peat loss in the Everglades. Basically, when you do something that aerates the soil, whether it's cut a ditch or make an impoundment or create a tidal restriction, and it's a peat-dominated soil, it's going to oxygenate that soil and cause decomposition. And it can happen at a dramatic scale or a subtle scale. So in Delaware Bay, for example, I mean we've got feet of elevation loss in former salt hay farms. In ditch marshes, it's more subtle. It's probably on the matter of inches, but still has important impacts. Here's a more recent study that shows this elevation loss at Barnstable Marsh, where there's a nice side-by-side ditch and unditched marsh. And if you look at this difference in elevation in relation to tidal datums, and we think about high marsh bird species nesting on a marsh that they don't want to flood, this is a big difference. That ditch marsh nest is going to flood a lot more. And so then you take in, the scale of this. 90% of the marshes in the Northeast, are flooding more than they probably should because of elevation loss. So it just leads you to, think that yes, sea level rise, but also, impacts of these past management practices are affecting, the resilience of the marshes and the species that depend on them. So I just want to step through, my understanding of what happened over the course of 100 years to a marsh that was ditched. So taking, a clue from our unditched marshes out there today, there's a diversity of hydrology where you've got, large channels, small channels, branching networks, isolated ponds, ponds connected to tides, ponds that are revegetating. You got low marsh, you got high marsh, you got, a diversity of features out there that yields high habitat diversity. When you ditched it, you homogenize the hydrology. You make kind of everything the same, which it lowers the water table. We drained all the pools, which means we get a net increase in the vegetated marsh. And then as Born and Cottam saw, you might even have a increase in high marsh vegetation. But they also saw in their 10-year study that that vegetation began to revert. If you're not maintaining these ditches, things get wetter again, the ditches silt in, and things revert. And so now you've got a marsh that has lost elevation because of the ditching. It's flattened out because the elevation is the highest elevations are what's lost, the most oxygenated areas of peat. So you got a flatter, lower marsh that's now getting wet again. As we go through the 20th century, we stopped maintaining ditches. And we've created this network, though, that allows water in really easily, with a storm tide or a big flood tide. But there's not a whole lot of energy to bring it back out. If you have a flat pancake marsh, water gets in and can kind of sits there. So yeah, we homogenize the hydrology, homogenize the geomorphology of the place. The habitat diversity is lower, and I think the resilience of not just sea level rise is lower, but just simply a summer drought or a flood tide. The ability of a marsh to manage these simple perturbations is lessened by the flattening and elevation loss we've seen. Okay, back to the old lure. The mosquito commissions in 1917, were inventorying how much they'd gotten to and how much they didn't get to in the dark shading. They still had a lot left in 1917, but the good news is that they never got to some of this marsh. So some of this marsh is unditched. So tens of thousands of acres in Cape May County and Atlantic County in New Jersey. Again, real treasures for understanding how wildlife uses an unditched marsh, how the unditched marshes respond to sea level rise, their dynamics. Just a lot to learn from these places. And just by just historical accident, they're not places that have gotten a lot of study from marsh researchers. I've been looking pretty intensively at a marsh we have on the refuge, Motts Creek Wilderness. That's the unditched marsh on the right there, about 1,600 acres. And comparing it to this ditch marsh on the left, and you can immediately see the incredible density of ditching that happened. You could also see that the unditched marsh has a lot more ponds, some really big ones. Wendy mentioned high marsh conversion alterniflora. That's something I've looked at on the whole coast here, and it's one of the most dramatic changes along this coast. We've lost about 6-7% of marsh overall, but 50% of our Spartina patens marsh since 1970. So big changes. But the interesting thing, dialing in at these two sites, Spartina patens cover did not change over that 50-year period on this unditched marsh, while it changed decreased by about 24% on the ditch side. So an indicator that this, is a good place to look at as a reference marsh, something to think about as a model for restoration. Whatever's happening here is at least holding up better than the rest of it. And looking at elevation, you can see these elevation differences on LiDAR maps. So all that light green there is the highest elevations out there, and we just don't have any of the light green on the ditch side. The average elevations aren't a whole heck of a lot different, just a matter of inches. But if you look at that, the scale of that map and the scale of all that green stuff, there's more going on here than just that, that change in mean. Just looking at that average in a graph form, you can see the ditch marsh kind of got a haircut. It's just missing that high stuff. But yeah, as I was thinking about, just the subtle differences, it means like, how to characterize what's, this elevation in a different way. And so I started looking at landforms. So classifying, as you would a mountain range or something, classifying all the little landforms out there, based on the elevation map. So convex features that would shed water, these ridges, shoulders, spurs, peaks, slopes, and then convex features that would collect water, and just see how that all looks out there. And then we get a extremely psychedelic looking picture depicting all these features. But the main thing to look at here is, we've got a crazy swirl over here in the Unditch Marsh, but then we have these discrete patches of gray, which are flats. I kept talking about the flattening of Unditch Marshes, and that's what we're seeing here. So all the interior areas of this marsh are just dead flat. So it means that when water gets in, it's probably sitting there longer and not helping the marsh, as far as like creating conditions ideal for organic accretion. Whereas out here, I would bet on a flood tide, the water is shed quickly into the the convex areas, which are mostly open water. Just to translate that insane map to a graph, this just shows the the predominance of flats in the ditch marsh. So each of the other features is sort of penalized a little bit in the ditch marsh, and it just all adds up to more flats. Just getting into like looking more about patterns of spartina patents lost and elevation out at that this area. The further you get from a channel, the more likely patents was to not convert to alternative flora over the 50 years, and that's for the ditched and unditched marsh. So in more isolated places, patents is more persistent. And then another pattern is that as you get more isolated, you get to higher elevations. And this really surprised me because it's, suspended sediment is settling close to channels, but here we're seeing the highest elevations far away from channels, which suggests to me that it's just organic accretion that's creating these high elevations under ideal conditions for accretion, I guess. And you could just see the difference in isolation. So you can't get very far from a channel in the ditch marsh, of course, because of all that drainage density. So I've been looking at other unditched marshes and finding similar patterns. This one's another marsh nearby in Tuckerton. So similar pattern. As you get further away from channels, that's where you're seeing your highest elevation. So more persistent Spartina patents, where you get isolated, higher elevations. And then you've also got ponds. That's where these isolated ponds are most prevalent, where you get furthest from channels. And so, yeah, I think all this may be related, in that in these isolated areas, I'm talking about high marsh, we're in high marsh, far from channels. You don't need channels. This is so infrequently flooded that there's not enough water getting up on that marsh often enough for a channel to form. And so I think these ponds are playing a real hydrological role. They're just not this nuisance feature, but they're playing a hydrological role. They are the tide shed, I think, in these highest areas of marsh. That when a flood tide happens, this is where water goes when it drains. And then these are very dry places. They're infrequently flooded. So in summer they get very dry, and these ponds probably help keep these areas wet, and create conditions that are ideal for organic accretion. This is all hypothesis. This is stuff that needs to be tested, but that's my sort of ideas I'm drawing from observing some of these data. But it makes sense. So what I'm saying really is that in order to have healthy high marsh, you may need to have these low areas that collect water and serve as reservoirs. And it makes sense in that the species that we're thinking most about right now in marshes for the Fish and Wildlife Service need both the highs and the lows, especially black grouse, which needs shallow open water habitat, like ponds. But they also need the high marsh adjacent to it to nest in. All right, so we're easing into the back end of my talk here. I'm just continuing to look at, find other ditched, unditched pairs where we can. There's not a lot of them out there, but there's a few. Barnstable Marsh is one of them in Massachusetts. It's got this famous study that is still a great read, written about it. And I did my my landform analysis on this map, and similar thing, maybe even more distinctive, going on. You can see the ditch marsh is much bluer. The unditched marsh is much redder. So the unditched marsh is more convex, more water shedding. The vegetated marsh out here, this is mostly vegetated marsh, is collecting water. It's a bunch of basins, in between these ditches. So I would again hypothesize that these marshes are, wetter and more waterlogged more often. And then the blue stuff in the unditched marsh are already water features, ponds. So, taking this information, this understanding, I feel like it, helps lead us toward, understanding what we're trying to restore out there. And I thought this comparison of these graphs help illustrate that. We've lost elevation and we've lost isolation. So the thing to restore is that isolation gradient by doing hydrological restoration, ditch remediation, creating branching channel networks and closing all those crazy loops that ditch marshes have, and then restoring elevation and topography especially. And so I don't think we can get around the idea that we need to restore elevation in these marshes. They've lost all this volume of peat, due to oxidation, and then probably accretion lags due to these unhealthy drainage conditions over this time. And we got to find a way, to restore this topography and elevation, at a pretty large scale. And just to conclude, just a couple examples that get at what I'm saying. Like these projects don't do the whole thing, but they do part of it. One of them is Slough's Gut in Delaware, that a few of us got to visit, thanks to Andrew McGowan, who took us out there a year or two ago. And this is where they took about a 30-acre marsh that was parallel ditched, and they just created their best approximation of a natural hydrology. So sinuous channels, a dead end in the middle of the marsh, ponds. And what they did here was they created that isolation gradient I'm talking about. So restored that isolation gradient. So you can get a little further from a channel now after it's been restored. And what I think this does is it just creates the conditions necessary for that geomorphic diversity to start reforming. But it's probably a long and slow process that needs to be assisted with some elevation addition and topography addition. But creating the ponds also probably improve drainage. And this is probably a more when it floods, it probably drains more quickly, or dries out more quickly, the vegetated marsh. You can see that here in colorful figure, lot more flats in the ditched areas than in the area that got restored. So in order to make this a perfect project, I would want to add some topographic lumps. And yeah, again, this need for adding elevation, given all this peat deflation and decomposition we've seen out there. I have an example from, a weird direction, open water marsh management. Like you, I'm horrified by this image of, pond digging across the marsh. But as I've grown, I've grown to understand this a little bit better and what they were going for. And so open marsh water management was a mid-20th century, really response to the work of Cottam, and the criticism of the loss of the ponds. And so what they did was start creating ponds again in a way that would control mosquitoes. So basically ponds that hold fish. But in the process, they created topographic diversity. They restored topographic diversity by digging ponds and using that peat material that they're digging up and putting it on the marsh surface. So it's not ideal because we're just working with what's left, like the material on site. I wouldn't want to dig ponds or redistribute material like this. Now I'd rather just add material, add to the sediment budget, as Neil talks about. But it's a proof of concept in, does restoring topographic diversity add some resilience to this marsh that's, in its unmodified state as a ditch marsh. It's very flat. So recently, a group of us have been looking at this area as a restoration opportunity. This is on the Forsyth Refuge. But it also happens to be a project area for a previous study that happened about 15 years ago. And what they did was they were looking at the impact of open marsh water management, OMWAM, And so they set aside a control area and then an area that they were going to dig ponds in. And, they did a lot of sort of real, like instantaneous studies of, changes in water levels, bird communities, fish communities, and, not a whole lot of, big conclusions from that work. But now 15 years later, we've been interested in seeing how these marshes have changed, since the intervention. And it's interesting because we got all this like on the ground data from the previous study that we could compare to today if we repeat it. I did some aerial imagery analysis and found, just like the on the ground work showed, that the two sites were almost identical with their cover dominated by Spartinopatens. It's a microtidal marsh. But then in 2019, the control area declined, patents declined by about 50%, while the WAM area held steady. So I feel like this is a proof of concept that the idea of digging, creating topographic diversity, basically inoculated these marshes, from even worse waterlogging and runaway pond formation like waffle ponding. And so, yeah, so I think more work is needed in places like this for sure. For example, hydrological restoration. And again, it needs more material. But, the idea that the topography that we've lost due to ditching and elevation is causing a good part of the problems we're seeing out there, and, leads to next steps. So just to review, elevation topography, I think I said it enough. Restoring hydrology, none of this is easy. All this is hard. Revegetating ditches, doing it at a scale, like these sites, some of these sites on the refuge, for example, are, you'd have to, it's just massive, the scale of, ditch remediation you would need to do. I don't think we need to dig any ponds, but we need to keep in mind that these low areas are needed on the landscape. We need, we can let the lows take care of themselves by creating highs, but we need that diversity of topography. We need lows and highs. And then dredge material, would be the first idea for adding all this elevation. But what we're finding, from now these studies that have happened, are now 6, 7, 8 years afterwards, that putting bare sediment, sand, or silt at high elevations it's a slow process of recovery. And so, ending here, but just mentioning, I showed during the show and tell at our last meeting, I showed this lump that we created this year at one of our sites. Which is like, again, a proof of concept. So this is a topographic feature that we created with municipal leaf compost, planted it in May, and it did incredibly well. If you plant, bare sediment with Spartinopatens, it, usually dies. So this is really encouraging as a, maybe a way forward to just find alternative materials where high marsh vegetation can do better more quickly to get the habitat we need more quickly. So yeah, I'll end it there and look forward to talking more and having a good discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. That was another great presentation. Again, I'm going to leave the major questions for the end, but if there's any clarifying questions folks have, feel free to chime in. All right. Well, Danielle, if we don't see anybody, then take it away to our last speaker.
My pleasure. Our last speaker is Dr. Mattia Jepsen. She is a bureau chief in the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's Division of Science and Research. She's a wetland scientist by trade. She's a wetland scientist by training. Her current research explores blue carbon using dredge material to enhance salt marshes and tracking the salt marsh responses to sea level rise using surface elevation tables and multispectral drones. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mattia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danielle. Okay, slides presenting okay? I never trust them.
Looks great.
Okay, great. So good afternoon. As Danielle said, my name is Mattia Jepsen, and I'm a bureau chief in the Division of Science and Research at the New Jersey DEP. Thanks to the CHARM group for inviting me to talk about some of the work that the Division of Science and Research has been involved in related to tidal wetlands in New Jersey over the past few years. An alternative title for my talk could be Everything Everywhere All at Once, because I'm going to try to go through a bunch of different things that we're working on, and I'll try to tie it all together, but you can let me know how I do. So I'll talk about the Division of Science and Research, where I work briefly. And then I'll talk about carbon sequestration in tidal wetlands, and then touch on sea level rise in tidal wetlands. So the Division of Science and Research within the New Jersey DEP, our mission is to ensure that the department's decision-making is based upon the best possible scientific and technical information. So we support technical and policy needs for the different program areas within the department. We perform research, we identify and understand emerging issues, and we attempt to integrate a multidisciplinary perspective into environmental issues. We have about 20 different research scientists that work on these particular topics. And we work on everything from environmental restoration to carbon sequestration to climate change to invasive species, harmful algal blooms, waste management, statistical analysis, environmental trends, offshore wind, you name it, we are working on it. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon sequestration and start with some background about why this is important. So more than a century of unsustainable energy and land use has led to global warmings of 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Every increment of warming results in rapidly escalating hazards around the world. More intense heat waves, heavier rainfall, and other weather extremes further increase risks for human health and ecosystems. In every region, you have people dying from extreme heat. Climate-driven food and water insecurity is expected to increase with increased warming. The IPCC and other climate change groups within the global community have stated that we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we're able to keep the warming to this level, we would significantly reduce flood risks from heavy precipitation events, reduce probability of extreme drought. Potentially, this could mean that 10.4 million fewer people would be exposed to the impacts of sea level rise globally. And this would help to prevent the extinction of ecosystems and species. The state of New Jersey is committed to taking decisive action on climate change, as evidenced by its ongoing climate mitigation planning and implementation efforts. The state's climate action is guided by a series of greenhouse gas reduction goals. Both legislative and executive actions have charted New Jersey on a course to respond to climate change and transition to clean energy economy. The Global Warming Response Act establishes 2 greenhouse gas reduction goals for New Jersey. There was one for 2020, which we met. Another one was set for 2030, and then there's a really ambitious one for 2050. In the fall of 2020, New Jersey issued the 80 by 50 report, which outlines pathways and recommendations to achieving the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals. In this report, it was noted that we can't meet this 20 by 50 goal unless we also increase carbon sequestration in our natural and working lands. So wetlands and forests are the main powerhouses of carbon sequestration in the state. We have folks in our forestry department who are working on the carbon sequestration of forests, but when we first started talking about all of this, we didn't have anyone who was working on the wetland portion. How do wetlands sequester carbon? Under what circumstances? How much carbon do they sequester? And so we needed to dig into this, the literature, to see what was out there, what the gaps were, and then to try to help to inform policies and land management decisions. So blue carbon is a term that refers to the role that tidal marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses can play in carbon sequestration. This slide has the basics of wetland carbon sequestration, and then on the next slide, I'll get into the specifics that we have settled on for tidal wetlands. So wetlands are some of the most productive habitats on the planet. Like other ecosystems, vegetation in wetlands pull carbon dioxide out of the air. They use it in photosynthesis, and then they sequester it in plant materials and in the soils. Wetlands also have a really special power to store carbon because of the presence of water levels at or near the soil surface. So these are things that both Neil and Joe talked about. The water level decreases oxygen availability, which slows down the decomposition rates of dead organic matter in the soil. As a result of the decreased decomposition, wetlands can develop deep deposits of carbon-rich soils called peat that accrue and can be maintained over thousands of years. So for tidal wetlands, we wanted to figure out how much carbon is sequestered in the wetland soils in the state, tidal wetland soils in the state, and at what rate are they, is that carbon accruing? So based on some global estimates that align pretty well with what's been found in New Jersey, tidal wetlands store around 109 metric tons of carbon in the top meter of soil. For anyone who's ever worked in tidal wetland soils, you know that the soils often, the rich carbon soils often are much thicker than 1 meter deep. But this is what has been averaged this is how deep most of the soil samples go. So this is what we have estimates for. Measured rates of carbon sequestration in New Jersey salt marshes range from 1.95 to 4.33 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre per year. The carbon dioxide equivalent factor or unit is important because it allows us to compare the net carbon fluxes, whether that be emissions of carbon in different forms or the sequestration of carbon to the same unit, so that you could compare methane that's released to nitrous oxide that's released to carbon dioxide that's released, and then compare that to the carbon that's being sequestered. So it gives us this one standard unit. For a variety of reasons, for the projects that we're using these factors in the state, we have selected 2.52 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre per year. And that rate could greatly increase as sea level rise in marshes that remain vegetated and intact. So as sea level rise increases, they're flooded the water is deeper and they're flooded for longer, which can allow them to pull more sediment out of the system and increase accretion rates. So another important factor in wetlands is that because they are flooded and that makes the system anoxic, methane is one of the byproducts that can be made during microbial respiration when oxygen is not present. So methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. Depending on the time frame that you're looking at, it can be 25 to 83 times more potent than carbon dioxide. In salt marshes, it's currently thought that the methane that is released back into the atmosphere, the amount of methane is relatively negligible, although new studies are suggesting that maybe that's not the case. But for right now, for the work that we're doing, the assumption is that there's very little methane released from salt marshes. In brackish marshes, between 5 and 18 parts per thousand, there is some methane that's released. And so the current factor that we're using for planning projects and evaluating projects is to think of them as having a net sequestration that's about half that of salt marshes. Oligohaline marshes and freshwater marshes also sequester a ton of carbon in the soils. They have very carbon-rich soils, but they produce more methane, and the methane release rate is quite variable. And so for this reason, for our current calculations, marshes have a net zero sequestration rate. These are all things that need more study and more specific data in New Jersey, but for planning purposes, these are the numbers that we're working with. We also looked at what happens to carbon that's stored in marsh soils when it's eroded. So when you have the erosion happening, those carbon-rich soils get mixed up into the estuarine environment. Some of it gets redeposited, some of it goes out to the ocean. Based on the small amounts of research that has been done on this topic, we estimated and we estimate that 25% of that carbon that's stored in the upper meter would be re-released as carbon dioxide in the first 3 years after an erosion event. And so you'll see later how we use this, but it helps us to think about the carbon benefit of implementing living shoreline projects. Okay, so based on some of the literature reviews and discussions with other scientists, we came up with 4 basic types of blue carbon projects that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions or increase net carbon sequestration. And these projects should be familiar to you because both Joe and Neil were talking about them. So the first is increasing salinity in marshes that have lowered salinity rates because of impoundments. So if you have a tidal restriction of a road, or you have an impoundment for waterfowl, you may have fresh water behind the impoundment, and you may have salt water, above 18 parts per thousand outside of that impoundment. And so if you restore that marsh and restore tidal flow to the marsh, you can drastically increase the salinity of that marsh. And as a result, you can eliminate or drastically reduce methane emissions. The second one is protecting the marsh edge from erosion. So if you install a living shoreline in an area that has been eroding quickly, you protect that stored carbon from re-emission, and you protect the vegetated marsh edge so that it can continue to sequester carbon. And lastly, we have the protection of marsh migration areas. So marsh migration areas are places that are currently upland, but that as sea level rises, if they remain unobstructed and undeveloped, can become the marshes of the future. So this research has been used in a number of different ways. I'm going to highlight 2 specific projects today. The first is a map layer in the New Jersey Coastal Ecological Restoration and Adaptation Plan tool, which is an interactive tidal wetland mapping planning tool, which does many neat things, including overlaying proposed restoration projects, which you can see here as these orange dots and blue polygons on top of a carbon sequestration map layer. The planning tool can be found on the Rutgers website. I have links at the end of the presentation to many of the different things I've been talking about today. So if you need a link to that, that will be there, and I can also put it in the chat after this. So this is a planning tool on the Rutgers website called CREP, the New Jersey Coastal Ecological Restoration and Adaptation Plan. This specific layer has color-coded tidal wetlands in New Jersey based on how much potential increase in net greenhouse gas sequestration would result from a restoration or enhancement project. It also identifies areas where marshes could migrate and become the carbon sequestering marshes of the future if these areas are protected from development or tidal restrictions. And you can also drill down into the layer to see why it got the rank that it did, and that could help you plan a project. So I know that those terms are a mouthful. So basically, we took the information from these past few slides. So this one, thinking about the rates of carbon sequestration, how much carbon would be lost during an erosion event, how much a new marsh could be expected to sequester each year, salinities, thinking about the different types of projects, and we attempted to put it into this one layer. There are areas that have high erosion, would be get a high carbon sequestration potential because you're protecting stored carbon. Areas of marsh that are expected to be lost due to sea level rise under low sea level rise scenarios by 2050. In saltwater areas would be areas that would be have a high restoration potential benefit, and areas where there are tidal restrictions like this one up here. So those are some of the uses of this particular site. Okay, next, we've also been using this research to estimate the net sequestration of restoration projects of the types that we mentioned earlier. The RGGI Strategic Funding Plan allotted 10% of the proceeds of a cap and trade auction for forests and blue carbon sequestration projects. The DEP, using this funding, developed the Natural Climate Solutions Grant Program to spend this funding. And as far as we know, it's the first carbon sequestration grant program in the country. We developed a spreadsheet to estimate the benefit of proposed tidal wetland sequestration projects. These estimates were used to rank the projects and to help pick the projects that would have the most carbon sequestration bang for their buck. And then the estimates were presented to the public to help increase the transparency of the benefits of spending this funding. The first round of the grant program funded $17.6 million in blue carbon projects, and those 5 projects were estimated to sequester 23,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent by 2050. Okay, so now, in addition to loving salt marshes for their long-legged birds, their beautiful smells, and their swishy green grasses, we can love them for their power to protect us from storms and helping prevent catastrophic climate change. However, as we've just been discussing, the persistence of tidal wetlands is threatened by sea level rise. So now I'm going to shift topics and talk a little bit about that. Okay, so as Neil went over earlier, as sea level rises, marshes can either gain elevation through accretion of plant materials and sediment to keep pace with sea level rise. They persist where they are. They can migrate into undeveloped upland areas. They can drown if they can't keep pace with sea level rise. The plants that are naturally pretty good at dealing with water levels, the water gets too deep, they get inundated for too long, and the marsh converts to open water. Knowing which marshes are going to gain elevation quickly enough to avoid conversion to open water on their own, and which ones may benefit from some extra help is key to a successful land management strategy. And these discussions about how to make these decisions, Neil has been talking about them, and so has Joe today. From a statewide look, the persistence of tidal wetlands doesn't look too promising. Here's some estimates, regional estimates. The thin red line on the graph represents a generalized elevation change rate for tidal wetlands in New Jersey. So because we don't have like regionally specific accretion rates for the state, we have been using this 4 millimeters per year. And that's this red line here. And then we can take a look at sea level rise rates from gauges across the state. The green bars here are averages from 1983 to 2001, and the blue bars are from 2002 to 2020. So this is the current epoch. And what you can see based on this very, generalized accretion rate is that tidal wetlands across the state would not be being expected to keep up with sea level rise. But we needed more specific information that was collected on the ground in the state, and not just modeled information. So in between 2019 and 2021, I worked with Judith Weiss, Beth Watson, Beth Rabbit, and Charles Harmon on a paper that investigated what was known about current impacts of sea level rise on tidal wetlands in New Jersey and what could be done to remedy the marsh loss. We collected information about trends in horizontal extent of New Jersey salt marshes, and also data that was collected in surface elevation tables, taking site-specific readings of elevation change in marshes, and outlined 4 potential remedies to address current coastal trends of marsh loss. And thinking about these in the context of New Jersey's regulatory and management environment. Those practices are similar to what has been talked about earlier today. That's protection of marsh migration, pathways, altered management of Phragmites, the use of sediment to increase elevation in marshes, living shoreline installations, and runnels. What we found was that at the time, the results were quite mixed. We didn't have a lot of data, and where we did have data, often the methods were mixed, making it difficult to assess trends across the state. The general trends that were found in this paper were that in the meadowlands, only marshes dominated by Phragmites were keeping pace with sea level rise. There was marsh area that was being lost to development, but some of that had been made up for by restoration projects. In the Raritan Bay, we especially had a gap at that time in data that was being collected. The Barnegat Bay had experienced 12% of marsh loss between 1972 and 2012. And most of the few surface elevation tables that were included in the study at that time in the Barnegat Bay were showing that marshes were not keeping pace with sea level rise. In the Delaware Bay, there were definite losses in marsh acreage, but some of those losses were really being made up for by marsh migration inland. So we had the most marsh migration happening in the Delaware Bay. And the surface elevation tables, again, there were only a handful included in this study, showed that about half were keeping pace with sea level rise and about half were not. So as you can see, the expected losses are not uniform across the state, and management decisions need to be tailored to the watershed and the site. That understanding requires the on-the-ground localized data that is collected and analyzed consistently across the state. So in answer to this need for better statewide data, groups conducting long-term monitoring of tidal wetlands around the state set about formalizing a network of sites in 2018. We had 15 entities sign an MOU formalizing the creation of the New Jersey Tidal Wetlands Monitoring Network. The mission of the network is to identify current conditions and trends of tidal wetlands in New Jersey to improve resilience of coastal communities and ecosystems by providing data to prioritize restoration efforts and support informed management decisions. Some of the things that we have been working on are standardizing protocols. We've had some actually really great success with that. We are working to share data across platforms and with each other. We're working to identify research needs and fill them across the region, and engaging the public around the importance of tidal wetlands. The paper that I mentioned earlier had, let me see if I can get this right, it maybe summarized 20 surface elevation table data from across the state. That was the best that we could do with publicly available information at the time. But now with the network, we have more than 220 surface elevation tables, so 220 marsh points across the state where we're collecting standardized information and we are collecting that data and putting it into a database. We've standardized vegetation protocols, elevation monitoring protocols, marker horizon protocols, and we're on our way to collecting tidal data at each site and water quality data in the same way. We've created a database to house the collected data. We recently added sites in the Raritan and in the Mullica Rivers, and DEP has provided some funding to partners to expand the network and just finished our first year of small annual grants funded by the NOAA Coastal Zone Management Program to help partners cover the cost of monitoring. Part of this work is that DEP created an ArcGIS hub. So this is the database that partners can put their data into in a standardized format and then also access their data and get it back out. It also has a public-facing web page that summarizes the data, provides photos, and will have educational resources. And we're expecting that it will have a summary map similar to this one on the left here, which is the Chesapeake Bay Sentinel Site Cooperative, where we'll have the points of the stations, these long-term monitoring stations across the state, and they'll be color-coded based on whether they're keeping pace with sea level rise or not. And you'll also be able to drill down into those points and see information about vegetation and tidal datums and soil chemistry and things like that as we expand the database. So we're really excited about that. Let's see. So these are, some of the metrics that we have been collecting and that will be included in the database. We're hoping that at the end of this year, when we have our first round of big data entry complete and the website is up and running, that we'll also be able to start doing a wetland trend report that will look, a 2-page fact sheet on the status and trends of tidal wetlands across the state of New Jersey that we could update every few years. We've also collected additional metrics at each one of the sites, kind of as needed. Diatoms have been collected at more than 100 of the sites and used to develop inferences about the flooding, salinity, nutrients. We've looked at the Tidal Creek morphology at each one of the surface elevation table sites. And it'll be great, Joe, to kind of take the research that you've done and see how we can apply that to the Tidal Creek morphology that we've figured out for each one of the sets. We've looked at land use around the area, and we've also partnered with NRCS to get soil cores collected in each one of these sites for both blue carbon purposes and also to have better tidal wetland soil maps. Okay, so I powered through that. I have a list of references and links, which I'm sure will be sent out afterwards. And that's it for me, and I can take any questions.
I love your picture at the end. That's great.
Yes, if there are any, I guess we'll start it off. Any clarifying questions from folks before we open it up to questions for all of our presenters today? Going once. All right, if that's the case, then I guess we'll take it to, yeah, if anyone has any questions from any of our presenters today, please feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat if you don't feel like talking. Don't be shy.
I don't have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll just make a statement. Overall, is the fact that, you know, this is great presentations by all the presenters for sure. You know, more so, we probably need to do more research in a duplication machine so that we can start, you know, duplicating all of our work so we can work together on a lot of different sites, because there's so much to do out there and only so little capacity for each of us. So great job, folks, and, you know, looking forward to connecting more.
Thanks. Yep, I agree with that. Brian, you had a question?
Yeah, also, I want to say those were really great presentations, really interesting. And I have a question for Neil. I was just wondering if you have a history of looking at any sites very localized, with very localized data from like drone imagery to look at UVVR and maybe assessing the response after restoration projects?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if we did it at Plum Island in response to an ice deposition event where ice actually, you know, brought sediment onto the marsh plain. So we've done that with drones. Right now, we're in the process of working at a site that has been newly actually engineered and hand planted. And our plan there is to do tracking of vegetation change as the actual marsh evolves. So we haven't done anything other than what we're starting to do now. I think Joe had some drone imagery of a restoration site pre and post action, if I remember correctly, but he can speak to that if he does. No? Okay.
No, just aerials.
Okay, great. Mattia, you have a question?
Yeah, Neil, just following up on my question about the, you know, looking at predicting where marshes will be in the future. I did a comparison looking at the SLAM modeling that was done for the state of New Jersey by Rick Lathrop at Rutgers, which goes out to 2050, and then compared that to the work that Duke has done looking at you know, marsh persistence into the future. And they use very different assumptions. Like the SLAM modeling, I think, uses that 4 millimeters per year elevation gain as a standard. And then the Duke modeling instead uses, I think it's like the Sparrow model, looking at the amount of sediment that might actually be available in the area. And the results are really different. And one of the interesting things is that then I took the Duke model that was looking at, you know, these accretion rates and then compared them to the accretion rates that we have mapped across the state. And there was also, they didn't seem to speak to each other that well. So it'd be really interesting to, you know, to take your model if and when you have it for New Jersey and compare it to, you know, as from a land management perspective and from a state perspective, it's confusing to have more than one model. I mean, more, you know, the models are only as good as the data input, obviously, and it's helpful to have different models because they provide different perspectives, but it can be confusing then to then try to use any one of those to justify a decision or to check somebody's restoration permit application.
Yeah. Yeah, like I put in the chat, the only comparison we've done with lifespan was with a MEM model that was done for Plum Island, and they agreed really well. And again, like I said in the chat, I think it's because under the hood of MEM, you're on this, there's a curve that tells you about biomass production relative to elevation with the tide. And I just have a feeling in Plum Island, in the model, in the MEM model, where you are on that curve, it happens to give you maximum production with elevation because of just the tide range and everything else. And the lifespan model is basically doing the same thing. It's saying, okay, how much of your marsh is above sea level relative to the tide? And that volume of sediment is what's giving you the lifespan. So I think that's why they agreed well there. I imagine with SLAM, there probably would be less of an agreement between the lifespan and the SLAM model even further, because those, I don't think those dynamics are in SLAM.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. Maybe we'll link up later when you're done.
Okay, great. See, Bill's got a question.
Yeah, thanks. For Joe, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on this, or you've looked into it, or the work in that you showed in the high marsh using compost or something, right, to grow Peyton's. It made me think of the potential for that, and how much compost there might be available to get something like that done. And is there, what made me think of is the idea of like using initially sediment capped with some layers of compost to see if that could get use that limited, possibly more limited resource of compost to go further in the site. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, the nice thing about some of these marshes and, on the refuge in Barnegat Bay, luckily you don't have to add that much to make a huge, to make a big difference. Like 6 inches of material can take you from mudflat to marsh. But yeah, I think the combination, wherever dred's available, like I think we should find a way to use it. And the distinction is to use it where it stays wet, so if we could fill ditches with dredge material, or start, filling, say an impoundment with dredge material and then topping it off with some of this organic stuff, or, wherever you want your high marsh. Yeah, that would be ideal. But yeah, the lessons from these previous projects, I was just looking at the one in Rhode Island on Narrow River, and just the struggles they've had. That, it was like something like, I don't know how many acres it was, but a lot of, dredge material on top of marsh, vegetated marsh that they tried to plant, and the stuff, just has not taken, and it's just been, 6 or 7 years, and they're just still struggling to adaptively manage. And but yeah, I think if you keep the material wet, it's things go pretty smoothly. But once it gets dry, then you have a long, slow process.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else have any questions for any of our presenters today? I'll give you guys a few seconds. You're pretty shy today.
Maybe during our panel discussion, some questions will come up as we start talking.
Yeah. All right. So since we don't, got one from Adriana in the chat. All right, it says, Joe, can you speak to the time intensity of the landscape feature mapping that you shared? It's impressive to look at the surface and could inspire conceptual or product design.
Oh, like how hard is it to do the analysis? Yeah, it just starts with a digital elevation model, and then there's a process in GIS that takes care of the rest. So yeah, not too difficult to do, and it works pretty quickly too. And yeah, like I would hope to, use some of these unditched marshes as a model for making some of these lumps and bumps. We do have a project at our Good Luck Point site where we're got some funding to do some of these lumps, hopefully this winter. And so we'll be, trying to, plan something like that out. And yeah, hopefully, ideally, you could do LiDAR at your site before and after and really document the change in geomorphology.
Danielle.
I'll ask a question. I would love to hear Neil's perspective on seeing those maps and Joe's perspective on like the topography and how that plays into the geochemical processes that you were talking about.
I'm sorry, that was a question for me. Oh,
Yes,
which biogeochemical processes?
like sediment, like you talk about the importance of sediment, budget on the marsh and how maybe those topographic features play into the way sediment moves on and off marshes.
Yeah, I mean, I know that. Yeah, I haven't spent much time thinking about it. I know that like microtopography has been a pretty important maybe leading indicator of imminent marsh vulnerability. So, I think like at some of the units where Joe shows very flat topography, that's kind of showing where all variability is kind of already started washing out, and maybe that's where the system is now crossing over. But yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how those small topographic changes would change, cycling of anything within the marsh unit itself. But there have to be strong feedbacks between those patterns and what's happening in the substrate, but I haven't thought about that very much.
I guess like I think about like how a flat marsh might have more like sheet flow, and so you have more loss of sediment because of that, and so it makes sense that habitat heterogeneity, topographic changes might retain sediment better, kind of like the vegetation does. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, tendency to trap, but I guess then, if you had a tendency to not trap, you would expect maybe more. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think actually you might, when you get more microtopographic changes and less smoothing, that might be an indicator of sediment starvation, because you're not filling in, because now then a natural system that has sediment supply will naturally start filling in depressions, right? So you would tend to trap where it's deep and scour where it's shallow. So if everything's flat, that's an indicator probably actually sufficient sediment supply from that perspective. So I don't know. I just convinced myself the opposite of what you said. So I'll have to think more about it.
I wonder if a manipulated system like the ditch systems might be different because the flatness is due to manipulation, but
yeah,
it's interesting.
Yeah, I came across a study yesterday, just an experimental study where they were just messing around in the middle of a marsh. In one area, they drained it. They put in like drainage pipes, and then they stimulated Spartina growth through that way. And then another area, they cut turf out and then put it up on top of the marsh, and they stimulated Spartina patens growth that way. So definitely like the Peyton's seems to like, where it's got some, sort of, more drainage relief, one way or another. Either it's, cutting low, cutting channels or ditches to keep it dry, or building it up high to keep it dry.
Brittany.
Hi, thank you. So I have a question for Joe. I have done a bit of research myself about using organic amendments in dredge materials and things like that. And so my questions always revolve around what are the greenhouse gas emissions that come from these organic additions? So you said that your proof of concept was using municipal leaf waste. Is that correct? Which
right.
is pretty bioavailable. Did you by chance look at what kind of emissions came off of that, or is it just to see if vegetation would grow?
No, thanks for teeing me up. I could say yes. We've done that. The lump I showed was sort of like let's try this at a larger scale. But the last 2 years we've had little pod experiments out in the marsh, little grow bags, all like similar elevations, replicated, and we had compost, we had silt from the ditch, like dredge material, we had upland sand, and then we also had just peat that we sort of harvested from an edge eroded area. looked at growth differences. And the one key thing was that the Peytons just hated the silt. It just withered and died in it under ideal, elevation and flooding conditions. It did all right in the sand. And then, this year, Charles Schutte from Rowan brought had a greenhouse gas analyzer and has been measuring some of these, greenhouse gas emission stuff. So more to come on that. But yeah, I wanted to do the due diligence as best I could, to understand, what, if there's any downside to using this compost. And, we may yet find that downside, but so far, we repeated the pot experiment 2 years, and it's similar patterns as far as good growth below ground and above ground. And then, yes, pretty spectacular results with our larger sort of lump. And, we'll just see how it fares through the winter.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm glad that it seems to be working. Can I, and I also have just a follow-up question to that then. So did you find that, if I know the data hasn't been analyzed yet, but do you think that if there were to be significant decomposition of the organic additions, that eventually it would lose that elevation gain that you created over time?
Yeah, that's well, I think that's kind of a feature in my mind, because it's like it would find if it would find the right elevation, like it would, if you overbuilt, it might decompose some. This compost stuff, it's going to decompose somewhere. It's like, going in a garden or whatever. So at least we're sequestering more of it than would have been sequestered in the first place. But I imagine it would find the right level, based on how anoxic the soil becomes. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk to you more about this, afterwards, for sure.
Sure.
Great. With that, I think we're gonna do maybe a couple panel questions for everyone. So one for all of you. I guess we'll go in order. Matea, then Neil, then Joe. Question is, so knowing that CHARM is a forum for resource managers, regulators, restoration practitioners, and academics, and knowing all the issues that are facing the marshes today, what advice do you have to this group as a whole, based on the work that you're doing?
So many different lenses to answer that question through. Advice as a whole.
Maybe we can help clarify a little bit that the mission of this group is to facilitate conversation. So hurdles that may come from, one group not talking to the other, thinking with that lens might help.
So maybe one thing that wasn't based on what I presented on today, but one of the lessons learned from the pilot beneficial use of dredge material projects that I've worked on since 2014 is that we did a pretty good job, I think, of documenting steps along the way. So, with current technology, if you take notes during meetings in something like OneNote, you can go back and search for any term that you have thought of. And so when I was writing lessons learned documents and reports, I was able to say, like, search for accretion, and then look at all the conversations that we had going back about accretion and be able to see, like, what our conversations were, how our thinking about the project changed over time. And then being able to keep track of that and then put out, even if it's just like a one pager or giving a webinar like this, I think, you keep track over time and then reflect on what, where you were, where you got to, how you got there. And I think these conversations like we're having now, and I was just reflecting on how cool it is to have, when I first started working in tidal wetlands, there wasn't anything like this, and now I feel like we share so much information, and because each project is so different, it's really great to be able to share out about all the things that we're learning, and so keep track of what you learn and share it.
Great advice. Neil, do you have some advice for the folks?
I don't have anything profound to say. I think You know, I just thought of something. I don't know how profound it is, but I think you're the restoration community and the practice community needs to kind of put pressure on scientists to translate their stuff a little better. I feel like there's and I mean, everyone on this call knows this, right? There's a huge gap between folks doing really great basic research on wetland processes and then the folks who actually have to go and get the permit to use dredge material or to do, facilitate upland migration or whatever it is. There's just such a huge gap. And I think it's the scientists' fault for not being forced to actually translate what they have that's relevant to those specific decisions. And so this community, I think, get some basic wetland scientists on here and tell them, we want you to make a presentation and speak to what your science actually does to help us decide where to apply for permits, where to worry about, fisheries habitat when we're doing thin layer, you know, those kinds of things. Like just kind of force that translation part to get a little better, and we might make some progress quicker.
I definitely agree with that one for sure. Thank you. Joe, any advice you have?
Well, I would agree. Yeah, I've often wondered, like, sometimes with restoration projects, it would be nice to have input from scientists on, this project. It just, it doesn't seem like there is a place in the process for that, and it would be probably helpful in a lot of cases. I don't have a lot of advice. I mean, I could just talk about, my, it's, I mean, at least as far as like, getting to what we need to do. I mean, certainly it's been a process for me, like looking at patterns of change or predicting patterns of change, really understanding these past management impacts, just because, we can't do much about sea level rise, but we can do something about these impacts that have happened locally that are, making these marshes even more vulnerable to sea level rise. So, that helps, just sort of make a plan. But then when we get to like, how to pursue restoration, that's where I need advice, because how do we, start getting to work and get it into a more routine process of just year after year, ticking away at it, just like those mosquito commissions did twice. They did it, the first time in the early 20th century, they dished everything. And then at least here in New Jersey in the mid 20th century, they dug ponds everywhere and seemed to effortlessly do it, cover the whole landscape. So I'd love to find a way to also, take a page out of their book somehow, work at a landscape scale, just year after year in a routine basis.
All great comment. I'll ask the next question. Thinking about the trends and the processes that you guys all just presented, do you have specific marsh restoration strategies or human interventions that have your green light? Do you have red flags? And which ones do you think we need more research on now?
Are we going in the same order? Are we flipping around? What do you want to do?
You can just jump on in, whoever wants to go first.
I'm just going to say, as a federal employee, I take no stance on the efficacy of different procedures. So I'm going to bow out of this one.
Really? I have to take that position too as a federal employee? I didn't know that.
You do not. I think Fish and Wildlife has different standards than us, but I'm not going to say anything yet.
I might be kind of in the same boat, maybe, but I feel like we all discussed a couple of project types that we think are going to be really beneficial, but that probably all need more work and are very site specific. So that would be, removing tidal restrictions, protecting marsh edges from eroding, increasing salt marsh vegetation in areas that have been denuded for a variety of reasons, and then protecting marsh migration areas. I think we all kind of talked about those.
Yeah,
and I didn't mention the sediment enhancement, but I think that one is maybe still kind of the most tricky.
Yeah, that's I mean, I already mentioned it, but yeah, using dredge material at high and dry elevations, I'd say that's a close to a red light. Unless you do things like I pointed out in another talk, like if you can mimic what that ice rafting process did, where you're doing patchy, thin, really thin stuff, then maybe it works at high elevation. But yeah, just advancing our techniques in dredge application and use would help. One thing I remember, like Neil was mentioning, like as far as resisting and living shorelines, like locking up the shoreline. Like I think of it as a more nuanced thing. Like it's more like thinking about what's happened on this coastline that's accelerated erosion and trying to mitigate that. We're not trying to stop erosion entirely, but trying to understand the things we've lost, that have like made that shoreline less resilient and less resistant to wave action. And like in Barnegat Bay, seagrass, oyster reefs, probably a lot of the sandy shoreline that was once there. We've lost all that, so we've got a much more exposed marsh edge, and just thinking that way. And it's certainly one of the eye-opening things from like looking at change in New Jersey is that 70% of the actual marsh we've lost is at the edge. It's not where I gravitate to intuitively or whatever, but it's where the data tells us that's where we can probably make the most impact if we can not stop it, but make sure it's not just out of control.
And
Especially
from a
in
carbon
places like-
sequestration, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say in places where there's no migration space like Barnegat Bay, right? Because we're so developed.
And also from a carbon sequestration perspective, it took thousands of years for that carbon to be sequestered and accrete, and it can be lost in one storm, so from a carbon sequestration perspective, it can be a pretty impactful place to work.
Just to follow up on the resist, accept, direct, I think that's like the context where, if you as a manager are resisting everything everywhere, then, maybe you have to make sure there's some things you're willing to accept and some things you're willing to direct. But that's what's helpful about that framework is then you can really evaluate your portfolio of options and make sure you're actually distributing them properly across the landscape in a reasonable way.
Yeah, I love that you shared that framework. It makes a lot of logical. I think we all work that way, but having a graphic to kind of describe that process makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I guess one more for you guys. What data gaps are hurdles to achieving science-based marsh restoration or conservation? And feel free to jump in if you.
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. It's which data gaps do you think are hurdles to achieving science-based marsh restoration or conservation?
I think maybe for me is in terms of my understanding, like Neil, you have a good sense of how to think about sediment availability and that net, is there net sediment flowing into the system or net sediment coming out? But I don't know how to do that, or how to do that, how to do it, and then how to do it in a way where we can do it at a low enough cost and accurate enough to be able to look at a site and then decide not to invest in it because it's got sediment, it's good. So maybe I'm missing, there probably are tools out there to do that I'm just missing, but for me, that's a piece that's missing.
Was I wrong to interpret that the UVVR was kind of a proxy for that sediment budget analysis?
No, that's correct. That's part of what it was intended to be. So you could use it as a proxy if you wanted to. We've done it. I wouldn't haphazardly use it everywhere. Yeah. But again, that's not an easy thing to, there are proxies, there are intermediate proxies that we've developed that just require, like one sensor. So a flood ebb suspended sediment gradient has proven to be actually pretty robust predictor of the sediment budget. So we've shown that you can do that, and that's simply just one turbidity sensor deployed for, the time period, for months, hopefully at least, through storms and things. So that's one proxy, but I would certainly recommend that kind of data pre and post restoration, because it's not, compared to the cost of everything else, it's a pretty small cost, and it gets you at least a semi-quantitative estimate of what was going on before and then what's going on after, so that have we actually improved the ability of the system to import sediment, or have we not?
So yeah, I don't know if this, it probably already exists again, but an easy SOP for a person who's going to go out and collect that baseline data, and maybe on the CHARM website or something like that, would be really helpful if it doesn't exist already.
I think we made one for the state of Massachusetts, but I'm not sure if they actually did anything with it. But I can look for that.
Something I want to understand better, like one of the things I think we can influence with some of these like restoration interventions is like conditions for organic accretion. Like I think of all these like flat marshes that are kind of tortured by too wet, too dry, never Goldilocks. And like some of these things, like I was talking about, like getting the isolation gradient back and adding topographic variation. I think like one of the measurable results I would hope is that you're improving rates of organic accretion or conditions for that. But yeah, so I'd like to measure that and look forward to when the tidal marsh monitoring network is fully out there, so we can maybe like look at patterns and get some clues about that.
Neil, do you have any research or data gaps that your group is not fulfilling that you see as a need for the region that this group could maybe try to pursue?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think the microtopography question is a good one. That's a really hard thing to collect, but estimates of microtopography along areas would be interesting. Stem density, like actual direct measurements of stem density, and being able to kind of ground truth a lot of the remote sensing estimates that have been done would be nice. And that's something we have as a program the USGS talked about trying to do, but that's really the big issue, is a lot of these data that have been collected for years by folks aren't actually published or collected the same with the same method, so it's hard to compare sometimes. So and I think the NERS have a project, right, to do this nationally, to standardize their stem density, canopy height type data. So once that comes online, that would be a good thing for someone to dig into in the mid-Atlantic and see how those patterns look and compare with remote sensing.
Great. We have 2 minutes left. Does anyone have any other questions they'd like to pose to our panelists? Panelists, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave with this group? Any words of wisdom or advice or final takeaways?
Not
No,
for me.
thanks for the opportunity and the conversation.
Thank you guys for taking the time and sharing your expertise with us. I will be reaching out to our speakers for some of the links and resources that they provided and ask them if they have any others that they'd like CHARM to be aware of. And I'll be sure to circulate that with the group. We had some housekeeping items I was going to talk about, but we'll save them for our October meeting, where we'll pick a final time slot. If you haven't filled out your preferred time, please do so before that meeting. We'll keep that Thursday slot for October, and we'll talk about our future meetings and our in-person meeting in 2024. Thank you all for coming. I will put this recording on the New Jersey Coastal Resilience Collaborative's webpage for us, so it can be accessed there if you'd like to share it with your colleagues, and I'll be sure to send that link to this group at the end of this meeting. Thanks again to our wonderful speakers. Thank you guys so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.